I'm interested. I've always been interested in what pushes people to the limits.
You were glorifying the empire.
I was glorifying the empire. I went through various phases of thinking, well, if I really play the game and I wear proper salwar kameez and don't go out without my dupatta and all that stuff, it would be better. But I don't know. It helped, though. The thing that I think it really helped is speaking Hindi.
So I totally understand how we get a bad reputation. Hello, this is Evil O, and welcome again to Dialogues. And today I'm speaking to somebody extremely special, Dr. Mary Storm, who is the author of a book. She's a well-known academic, and she has authored a book called Heads and Hearts. I think it is Heads and Hearts. I have to read this. Valor and Self-Sacrifice in the Art of India. Did I get it correct?
Yep, head and heart.
Head and heart. Okay, head and heart. So we're going to be talking about heads and hearts today, but not necessarily in the context of your book.
Yes, not academic heads and hearts.
Can you first explain a little bit about your book and about your academic career? Just a little.
Yeah. I'm interested. I've always been interested in what pushes people to the limits and how people respond to extreme circumstances. So when I was doing my dissertation research at UCLA, I became interested in these images from Mamallapuram that show the 7th century devotees, bhaktas, offering their heads to this composite goddess,
Right.
Koravai, Durga Koravai. And I thought, no matter how devout you are, you don't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to take my head off. So even if you're really gung-ho. And so I was curious.
Yeah, obviously, some people do. It was immortalized in stone.
Right. There it is, 7th century. And a lot of people interpreted these as metaphoric. And I thought, are these metaphoric images, the displacement of the ego and all that stuff? And then so I started digging around, and literally, and found a lot of these images. And at a certain point, they moved from being hero stones, where they're loose on the ground, or they were put up, in memorial to someone, to actually being incorporated into a formal iconographic program in a temple. And so that, that itself reflects a kind of blessing or imprimatur of this practice on a orthodox level.
Right.
So I thought, what were the circumstances that led to this? What were the stressors or the developments within Hinduism that said this is acceptable? Because early Hinduism, or early Indian religion, I guess you'd say, has a very ambivalent attitude towards taking of your own life.
Right. I was just reading that part of your essay this morning that really drew a lot of lines between acceptable suicide and non-acceptable suicide. Non-acceptable suicide was met with some pretty brutal punishments, where you were sent to hell and immersed in, I think it was black ooze and pus or something like that was one of the lines. Didn't sound very welcoming.
No.
But there are acceptable reasons to commit suicide.
In every tradition.
Yes.
Everyone there. It's this extreme in every tradition. So it's not just within Indian religion, but I mean, you can find it in the Abrahamic religions as well. There are times when suicide is absolutely condemned, and other times when we say, "Oh, martyrdom, aren't you a saint?" Right. And if you look back at classical antiquity, there are lots of stories of the idea of self-giving. And when does that become okay? So if you look at the story, say, of Prometheus, he knew he would be punished severely by the gods for creating fire and giving it to man. And he was. I mean, he was punished for eternity of having his liver plucked out. But the social benefit of giving fire was worth that sacrifice.
Right.
And so I think there are times when we say, all right, this act of self-giving is good. You know, obviously very commonly in war, we say a soldier who runs off into the field knowing he's going to die, but he's going to save his fellows. He wasn't on this, I mean, we might say a suicide mission, but we still honor this guy. You know, we still say this was a noble thing to do.
Well, you still think of that in terms of jihadis.
Yeah, well, you know, one man,
that thing, or kamikaze pilots, you know, during World War II.
Exactly. To their culture, within their cultural framework, what they were doing was noble.
Right, of course.
Know? We don't think so, but within that society at that moment. So it's always that moment, whatever that moment is, of crisis that condones something like Masada or, you know, seppuku or whatever it is, you know, these extreme forms of
well, what's the story? I should know this, the story right here from Chittor in Rajasthan with all the women who go and throw themselves on the fire.
Exactly.
Because they don't want to be conquered.
Right. So, I mean, that's the ultimate, you know, idea of.
It's not always men.
No. But the thing that in that article that I sent you, the thing that I found so interesting about that is that I think Johar, when women, you know, like a Chittorgarh or Sati, is like a different thing. It's both simpler and more complicated. But the thing that, with those images from Nalgonda in the article that I sent to you yesterday, is that women usually are not seen as desirable offerants. You know, so that in most of the texts it says, you know, the ideal sacrificial animal is male.
Yes, I noticed that in the essay, it was all male animals. But then I always imagined that many times with sacrifices, and maybe I'm going back to the Greeks, but it was always like the young virgin, wasn't the young virgin the sacrifice? There seemed to be a switch from male to female there.
Right. Iphigenia, for example, is the perfect, or Jephthah in the Old Testament. The idea that a young virginal girl is pure.
Right.
So whatever it is,
they used to be in the old days, yes.
But that is women in those circumstances. It's where women don't really have agency in those circumstances. Whereas those Nalgonda images, those women are being honored for choosing self-sacrifice, as opposed to being a sacrifice. I mean, they are a sacrifice, but they've chosen it. So what are the, you know, why do we do that? And I think right now, while we're going all through all this pandemic chaos and social upheaval that goes with it, you see a lot of these arguments being proposed that, oh, well, the old should sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the economy, or you should be willing to go, I mean, this is an extremist voice, but you should be willing to go out into society to restore normality.
Right.
You should put your life on the line to restore normality. And when we talk about the sacrifice of you know, healthcare workers who are working on the front lines, you know. So, I mean, some people do get annoyed with this idea that
many of whom are dying.
Yeah, many of whom are dying.
And then also there's the whole notion of suicides, you know, when we're all under lockdown. And I mean, even myself, the past 3 weeks, I've had more suicidal thoughts than I've ever had in my life, because I just feel so hopeless and alone sometimes. And I speak this freely because I'm sure I'm not the only one. Many of us are going through these feelings right now, that especially if we're goal oriented and we have an agenda and there are things we want to accomplish in our lives, you just feel like, oh, life is just shut down. It's over. I'm old. I might as well just do away with myself, you know. And I'm sure that's going to happen in many cases. People lock down.
Well, this feeling that you're, I think for many older people, that being, you know, this feeling that your contribution is not valued. I think we live in a very ageist society. And this idea that, oh, you're past your prime, you no longer have anything to offer us. So, why don't you at least, get out of the way? I think.
But there's something really sad about that attitude. I always say with the death of every old person, there dies a million stories with them. Old people have so much knowledge and so much, it sounds very self-important to say that when you are an old person, but the fact is old people have a wealth of knowledge. They've lived for so many years, they've experienced so many things, and they've seen how society has changed. So they know that change is possible. And it wasn't that long ago, I was telling Ganpat, my assistant, who's still fairly young, and I was saying, life will not always be the way it is now. Udaipur will not always be the same way. India will not always be the same way. You're going to see radical change in your life because I've seen it in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And when you're young, you tend to think that things will always be the way they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I think even for people of our generation, you probably had, when you were in college or whatever, you probably had to worry about the Vietnam War, getting drafted. But
I was terrified.
But I had cousins who
I was going to play the gay card. The gay card was going to come out really quick. So.
Well, I have a very good friend who was drafted, and they didn't know what to do. He had applied for a CO, conscientious objector status, and it was towards, I guess it was about the middle of the war, and for us. And so they said, okay, fine, we'll give you a CO, but we're just going to train you as a medic. That means you go to the front lines without a weapon.
Oh, okay.
It was very punitive for those who asked for COs, and he came out of it fine and dandy in many ways. He's a medic, and he learned some interesting training. But I think that was the closest our generation came to those kinds of fears and anxieties that our parents lived with, Right. My father was born in 1900. I was a late baby. And he was very tall, and so he was able to fake his way into the Navy in 1916. And so he was in World War I and then in World War II.
Wow, both.
Yeah, both. Okay. And my mom was she was worked with psychiatric with people who went through what we would call now PTSD in World War II. So I think from our parents' generation, or my parents' generation, that experience, of course, shaped their lives in ways of the idea of what do you do as a member of society? What are you willing to sacrifice of your own freedom, your own safety of your own being to support your fellows? So I think that, shapes.
That's a very big portion of keeping a civilization alive. It seems like every civilization has to rely on a certain amount of sacrifice, among both the men and the women. Not necessarily sacrifice in terms of allowing themselves to be killed, but just sacrifice in labor, work, child rearing. Sacrifice is part of society. If you're not willing to sacrifice, you don't have a civilization. That's why civilizations sort of die out when people get too hedonistic.
Or too, yes, hedonistic's a good way of putting it, or just too concerned with their own personal comfort.
Right, exactly. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we met because I found that interesting, and I hope you're comfortable talking about this. But you and I were introduced by Sunil Mehra on Facebook, and he said, Waswell, there's somebody you should meet, Mary Storm, you might have some things in common. And I learned very quickly from you about the incident that happened in Kolkata with your job. Are you comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, sure.
Tell that story because, I'm tentatively naming this segment White Migrants. And we've got to veer over to that subject, which, you know, being a white migrant, and, you know, this is like following the discussion I had last week with Shaheen Ahmad about immigration, migration into Assam. And we were talking about immigration. But, you know, when it comes to white people, many times we label ourselves expats. You know, like we're in some sort of different category, which maybe we are. So there's a lot of things to discuss about privilege, white privilege, and all of that. But just tell your story about what happened in Kolkata.
Well, it didn't really just happen in Calcutta, but Calcutta was a sort of a significant moment, I guess. I ran a program, a study abroad program for American university students. When I first sort of landed in India, I was doing research, and then I finished up my PhD.
Was this when you were connected with JNU?
No.
No, it wasn't the JNU years.
When I finished my PhD, I was in India, and I'd made this decision to live in India, and I was teaching at JNU for a while, and I loved it. I had wonderful students, and really, I loved my colleagues. It was a lot of fun. It was a great experience.
Yeah, JNU's a nice place.
Yeah, I mean, it was all the things that, you know, you hope your academic life will be.
And
anyway,
you became friends with Kavita Singh and all those cool
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that whole scene. That was really fun. It was a wonderful experience. But anyway, I wanted to make some money, and at that time JNU wasn't paying very well. So I got this job running this study abroad program for a consortium of American colleges and universities. And this was, when I first started, this was in 2005 when I started. And at that time, the whole kind of politics of what do they call it? You know, the culture of complaint or grievance politics or whatever the term is, you know, it hadn't really taken off. Okay. And so things were okay for a while. And then it started to heat up in the last few years, the whole, you know, divisiveness and identity politics that, I mean, are certainly important, but become destructive at a certain point of you know, when maybe immature people get the bit in their teeth and start running with it, it can become very destructive. And anyway.
It can be an ideology that changes the world for better, but it can also be a very destructive ideology.
Yeah.
When people don't really understand the world yet.
Yeah. So when you're 19, your frame of reference is pretty much high school, and your own privilege of, you know, how did you get to India and the study abroad program? Probably, you know, most people find themselves in a rather privileged position to get there. But anyway, I used to take students around India. They would have classes in Delhi. We would have intensive language classes in Hindi, and then we would do like a 10-day excursion. And so when we would go to Calcutta, I would always take them to the Park Street Cemetery, because I think it's a fascinating place to talk about the whole British colonial adventure and how that came about, and why 18th century, 17th century, and 18th century Brits were impelled to go to India. Why did they take the chance? It was often second sons who had no chance of really making it in the UK or England, and needed to find an income. And the riches of India were extremely seductive, you know, fabric trade and spices, and, you know,
go east, young man, and make your fortune. Go east, young man, yeah.
But you also had a very high chance of dying of malaria, cholera, typhoid, etc. So going to the cemetery, I think it was, you know, it's a way of looking at these people as human, and sort of thinking about the whole process of industrialization in Europe and in England, and this craving for raw materials that drove the colonial adventure of, you know, desperation for raw materials to feed the rising textile mills and so forth in the UK. And also the early days of the colonial experience, I think were
yeah, you said colonial adventure. I think that's a microaggression.
I shouldn't say that. Um, the early days of the structuring of, and you can't really talk about colonialism really until later in the whole process either. But certainly not maybe in the 17th and early 18th century. It wasn't exactly colonialism at that point. But whatever it was a lust for wealth and materials to support an economy in upheaval that was to support the British economy that was in, for whatever various reasons. But in the early days, there were also some very interesting people who were genuinely fascinated by India. People like Prinsep and Sir William Jones, for example, were real scholars and fascinated by everything in India, especially Sir William Jones. I mean, we owe a lot of our understanding of ancient Indian texts to his work in Sanskrit and his enthusiasm, incredible knowledge and deep love of Indian texts and sources. And so he's buried.
The Sheldon Pollock of his day.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. I mean, just an extraordinary scholar. And he died very young. I mean, he died, I think he was in his mid 40s or early 40s when he died. So the amount of work that he managed to do is just astounding in that short lifetime. And anyway, he's buried in the Park Street Cemetery. So, I sort of feel that students should take darshan of Sir William Jones, his tomb, and, putting all this in context, what happened to these early days when Westerners came to India hat in hand. They had to get contracts with the Mughal administration. And of course, in the very early days, they had to negotiate with a very powerful dynasty. And then gradually, as the Mughals started to collapse, it became much more free for all. But in these early days, what were the things going on? From this, people like Sir William Jones, very refined gentleman scholars, to these rapacious people who were just, wildly looking for it was the wild east, they were just looking for money.
And people just trying to make some fast bucks.
Exactly. Yeah. And there were lots of characters and scandals and, people who would, young men who were put in charge of ships and in their early 20s, or troops of military men in their early 20s. I mean, it was really astounding. Anyway, so there I was with these students, and I was trying to convey some of this, all the stuff that was going on. And one of my students said, "Why should I care about any of these people? Why should I care?" And went off. This boy was, I don't know, like 20 years old, and he went off in this sort of rant about the stupidity of it all. And it's like, I don't really care what you think as a 20-year-old student. Your opinion is no more valid than anyone, some guy on the street. Your position, you should be in the position of trying to understand the larger picture. Why all this happened. Your approval or disapproval is really irrelevant. And so that, I think,
and also to gain some sympathy, just not for the scholar, but some sympathy for the young boys who came over on boats, a long journey, thinking they're going to improve their lives, and they just got scurvy and malaria and died in a strange country, in the humidity and, away from family and home. And they were not part of a colonialist enterprise in the sense that they had planned it. They were right. Pawns in the game.
They were sucked up into it. They were as much victims of the whole thing as, others. It's what you were talking about, this idea of a society that's sort of gone to rot through hedonism. It was, it's sort of the rot of a more highly structured hedonism, of a capitalist system that, is good and bad, but it's often, I think we're living in a time right now where capitalism has become quite corrupt.
No, it's out of
And
control. It means everybody thinks I'm this rabid capitalist in my theory, but actually, I believe in socialism in many ways. I think that capitalism has to be moderated. But let's get
yeah.
back to your Kolkata story.
Oh, my Calcutta story.
So how
Well,
did this all end? Come on, tell us how it
well,
ended.
how it all ended is that we got back to Delhi, and my students complained to the organization that I was working for, that I was a unrepentant, um, um, backsliding, whatever, and that I
You
was
were glorifying the empire.
I was glorifying the
You
empire.
were glorifying the empire, obviously.
I didn't feel as if I was trying to glorify the empire, but I was, any more than I think if you go to Pompeii and you talk about, Marcus Aurelius, are you trying to glorify, the awful things that the Romans did? I don't think so. It's like,
Yeah, the Romans did some pretty cool things besides conquer all the Mediterranean and North Africa and
yeah,
Britain.
but as a historian, I don't think the good and bad part. It's like people who say, I really hate Hemingway because he was a misogynist. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to have been married to the man, but I still like to read his writing. I still find it interesting. And I think we have reached this kind of crucial point where we can't separate. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge the author. There's this great thing that
The death of the author.
The author is dead, right? Okay, so if we say the author is dead, are we then worried that Hemingway was misogynist? If the author is dead, should we worry about the inequities of the Roman Empire or the British colonial system? Yes, we should understand them. We should understand them. We should see it in context.
But anyway, the end of your story is you were fired, right?
Yeah, eventually, I was fired.
You were fired. What a tragedy. I mean, here you is such a knowledgeable person as Mary Storm, and you were fired because you triggered some 20-year-old kid.
Yeah.
I find that a tragedy,
At the time, I was really, as you can imagine, I was really upset and I was really angry. And now I think, well, that was a blessing,
Yeah.
I'm glad to be out of that world. And certainly,
So let's talk about some of your India adventures. Now you're living in Sri Lanka. You're somewhere near Gaul. What's the name of your village?
Habaradua.
Habaradua. Okay. Is it on the ocean?
Well, if you go down the road about 5 minutes, yeah, the ocean's right down.
The ocean. But before that, you had a big place in Rajasthan. I was amazed. You had a huge place in Rajasthan.
That was fun. Yeah, that we at least
for a number of years.
Yeah, that was. I love the farming part of that, and I love the farming part here. We have cows and chickens and lots of coconut trees and rubber trees and cinnamon, and yeah, I love that feeling of growing.
So let's get into the part of, okay, so we're both expats. Is there a difference between an expat and a migrant or an immigrant?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think expat has a certain connotation of I didn't have to do this, I'm kind of privileged. And I think a lot of expats use that, well, I shouldn't have to stand in line at the bank, or, I should be able to push myself ahead. And
Now, expats can be absolutely horrible, and sometimes I just cringe. And in fact, I hate getting together with groups of expats because all they seem to do is talk about their visa issues so many times. And each one is more intelligent than the other in explaining the proper way to get a visa for Cambodia or whatever it is, And it's like, oh, give me a break. I mean, number one, the visas are all different depending upon which country you come from. The rules are different. Yeah. So I totally understand how we get a bad reputation. But to me, one of the definitions is a migrant moves from a country to another country because they need something or are looking for something. They're looking for work, they're looking for freedom from a repressive regime, they're needing more opportunities. I think the expat has more the connotation that I'm retired or I've made some money and I can afford to go live someplace else and I don't have to
or I'm
worry.
taking a job, or I'm taking a job and I'm someplace I don't really want to be.
Yeah, you're taking a job and you're getting what's the hardship pay.
Hardship pay. That always cracked me up, that you could get hardship pay for living in Delhi.
I know. I mean, I have a friend like that. If he's listening to this, he'll know I'm talking about him. But he always laughs about the fact that he gets hardship pay and he just absolutely loves Delhi and loves India so much, but he gets hardship pay for being here.
Yeah.
So, but anyway.
Well, I think there's also there's expats, there's migrants, and then I think there are exiles. And
Right.
I feel I put myself in the exile category because I made a choice to leave a culture I didn't feel comfortable with,
Which was the US.
which is the US. And I've lived in Japan, and I've lived in France, and they're both cultures that I admire greatly, but fascinating, very strong aesthetic in both places, different, I mean, really, emblematic of both East Asia and European culture. But I never felt like I could live there, In India, I felt as if I could live there.
Right.
And it was also where my research was,
India is very welcoming. And it's sort of a very loving culture. Once you get to understand it a bit, it's a very loving culture.
Yeah, it's very
and
exciting.
I have a hard time, I always say, well, if I ever get kicked out of India, I won't go back to the US. I mean, because I find Americans just boring. Well, they are. Once you've lived around the world a little bit and you go back to the US, it seems like people have such narrow minds, such closed minds. They have such small amounts of experience, unless you're maybe in New York City or someplace, which is very cosmopolitan. But
yeah.
Other than that,
I have to let my dog in, who's doing this.
I will pause it a second, okay? I just pause it. And there we go, recording. You can't have a conversation with evil Orientalists without him bringing out his hookah.
Yeah, okay. Or with me and my teacup.
They're not selling beedies or cigarettes in Udaipur anymore due to the coronavirus and the lockdown. So I dug out my old vape and found out that it still works and I still have juice.
Yeah, no, there's no tobacco here, and there's no alcohol. And people are pretty wound up about it. I mean, I neither smoke nor really drink much, so it's
sometimes I find the white privilege thing just really embarrassing over here. Like, I've had a lot of times, and when I say a lot, I mean at least more than 3, which I've gone to the airport and like everybody's standing in a huge queue. And this is back in the days when I would travel economy. And somebody would walk up to me, who was Indian, they would be a staff and they'd say, sir, tap me on the shoulder, and they'd take me into the business line just because it was shorter. And even though I had an economy ticket, they would move me to the business line so that I could go through easily. And, it's hard to say no to that when there's a long line. But I've had the issue too, like when I took Ganpat and Jay Prakash to Bangkok. And when you enter the airport in Bangkok, there were 2 visa queues. One is for the Indians because they only get 2 weeks. And if you're American, you get a 1-month visa on arrival.
Okay.
And they're at least they used to be very hard on the Indians. And so I was trying to stay with Ganpat and Jay to make sure that they got through properly. So I was in the Indian queue with all the Indians, and I was going to go over to my own eventually. I just wanted to make sure they had no trouble. And oh, they kept pulling on me, the Thai staff. Sir, you're in the wrong line. You're in the wrong line. You have to go over there. No, I want to stay here. I just want to make sure that they got through okay, you know. And it's just very odd, I feel sometimes, you know.
Yeah. Well, there is the privilege. But then again, there is also the, what should we say, the handicap of being a white woman at times that is pretty damn irritating.
Right.
You know, that is not so charming or feels so nice.
The assumption that if you're a white woman, you're easy.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And, you know, now I feel like, you know, I'm gray haired in my distinguished dotage, but when I was young, it was really, it could be damn annoying. And I mean, I have to say in Japan as well, it was bad. You know, everyone says, oh, the Japanese, everybody's so polite. You know, not all the time, and not all the time to women. So yeah, it can be pretty annoying.
Well, in the old days, Tommy and I, when we first came to India together, which was 2000, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, 2000. I had been here prior, but we came together in 2000. We were traveling, in those days, we traveled on 1,500 rupees a day. And that was for both of us. 1,500 rupees we were really budgeted. We were budget travelers in the extreme. And that had to pay for train tickets, hotels, but then you could find a guest house room for like 100 rupees, you know, with a spot toilet and all of that. And we really budgeted, and we ate off of telas most of the time and things like that. We were super budget travelers. And, but anyway, we got to Jaipur, and we were, as gay men, just kind of enjoying the attentions of many of the young Indian men who tended to look upon anybody who was white as somebody who might have money, even though at that time we really didn't have money, you know, and so they would sort of fawn over you a lot. But then we were in Jaipur, and they have those rickshaws with the seats are in the back too, and we met a Canadian girl, and we were sharing the rickshaw with her, and she was in the back and we were like more in front, and she just tapped us on the shoulder and said, just look. And so we turned around and looked, and like there were like 15 Indian boys on the bikes following the rickshaw, and they were all going, you know, like this. I mean, it wasn't one, it was like 15 of them. And like for the first time, we got a feeling of what it's like to be a woman traveling in India, a single woman traveling alone, you know. And in those days, I think it's gotten better, honestly. I think it's gotten better. But I think, you know, in those days, I would hear so many stories from single European travelers mostly.
Well, I mean, I went through various phases of thinking, well, you know, if I really play the, you know, the game and I wear proper salwar kameez and don't go out without my dupatta and, you know, all that stuff, it would be better. But I don't know. It helped, though. The thing that I think it really helped is, you know, speaking Hindi and being able to let some, you know, shithead have it for being rude and inappropriate. That was the best. And I am not shy about letting shitheads have it. So.
Right. Neither am I. I have a reputation of having an explosive temper. And I've never learned to properly speak Hindi, but you know, I've surrounded myself with my gang, so I'm generally with my Indian boys who kind of protect me if I have any hassles of any sort.
Yeah, well, if you have Indian friends, it helps. It helps, but it doesn't necessarily isolate you from, I mean, as a woman, it doesn't really isolate you. And you know, it helped when, you know, I was married and all those things help. But I still feel like that is one aspect of Indian society that I don't admire. And I don't think any woman does, Indian or foreign. I mean, it's just irritating as not good, not good. And
what do you think?
What?
Excuse me if I'm interrupting you.
No, go ahead.
What do you think about like the double price structure at the museums and things like that in India. I think it's the same way in Sri Lanka. 10 rupees for Indians and 300 rupees for foreigners.
Well, I think everybody should have to pay a little more. So you go to the museum, and I don't think that it should be 10 rupees for Indians. I think it should be enough that it's like, ooh, this is, a special thing, and this is my heritage, and I should behave myself and not scrawl my name on the
My
wall.
feeling is it should at least be the price of 2 bottles of beer, because I know everybody can afford 2 bottles of beer.
Exactly.
So
Godfather 1,000 at least. You should have to pay to because this is how people behave. It's like, oh, this is cheap. No, it should be enough that you respect it. I think in theory, I had an employment visa, and so in theory I didn't have to pay. I could pay the Indian price because I was a resident. And in Delhi, if I went to Humayun's tomb or something, they would recognize that and say, oh, you're on an employment visa and you pay the Indian price. But other places where they didn't see that very often, there are very few, foreigners on employment visas. They would always make me pay the, whatever amount just made up on the spot sometimes.
that's my friend Felon Delhi has the same problem because he's on a diplomatic visa. And so theoretically, he should get into all of the museums and the archaeological sites and all of this with some sort of a pass that they give him. But he says it's not worth it because you always have to argue with the guard for an hour before they will approve it. So he says just pay the full price and just.
That's sort of how I did it. But I think if you are on employment or diplomatic passport, I think I paid taxes in India for many, many years, a lot of taxes.
Yeah, so have I.
Yeah, I mean, really, I was like 33% of my income in taxes. And so I felt like, okay, I should have the same benefits that an Indian citizen has. If an Indian goes to the Grand Canyon, they're not paying a special foreigner's fee. They're paying the fee to get into the national park.
There's very few places that have a different fee structure. I mean, the Art Institute of Chicago had for a while, they had something if you were a Cook County, I think it is, Chicago County resident, you had a certain fee. And if you were outside, you couldn't prove that you lived in the county, then you had to pay a little more, but it wasn't that much more. I also remember where Chicago used to have pay what you will prices too. Whatever you can afford, you can pay to get in. So, but most places in America seem to me like they're pretty much, this is the admission fee.
Yeah.
So my attitude with India all the time is, honest to God, most of the people who can only afford 10 rupees to come into the museum don't go to the museum. That's the hard fact of the matter. So why not balance it out, bring the foreigner price down a little and bring the Indian price up a little and meet in the middle and make it standard. But I don't know.
And use some of that money for what it's supposed to go to, like maintenance of the monument and
conservation. Research, book publishing.
Yes.
Yeah, let's continue the list.
Yes.
Well, enough of that. But obviously we love living in Asia, otherwise we wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
And we are privileged in many, many ways.
Oh, yeah.
So
absolutely. I like the feeling of India as opposed to, say, Sri Lanka or Japan or France, is this feeling that it's so complicated and the history is so dense and so old that I would never begin to understand.
Right.
And as a historian, that's absolutely a wonderful feeling that you would never run out of things to research. It's just this incredible, it's like opening this box of chocolates and all these delicious things are there. You can write about these great topics and vast complex subjects are just waiting for you to sink your teeth into them.
Have you run into any problems like Sheldon Pollock and Wendy Doniger with just the fact that you're a foreigner writing about this subject? That's
No, I have been lucky in that regard. When I started my dissertation research back in the 90s, I was told by when I applied for funding and so forth that I applied for an AIIS fellowship, and I was told I had to be really careful and I was going to get a lot of pushback, but I never did. People are always very gracious and open about research access, and I never got that. And I think because the articles I've published or my book, it's fairly obscure. I've been lucky. I've never had anybody, go after me or give me a hard time. So
and you're invited to speak at symposiums and things, I imagine. And
yeah, although I haven't in a long time. I've sort of been in my little world now I'm doing a second edition of my book. And
okay.
yeah, because suddenly, how we react to pandemics and disasters is sort of on the forefront of everyone's mind, So I'm suddenly, from being really obscure, my research is more relevant. Yeah, so I'm going into a second edition. That'll be fun. I mean, I'm looking forward to revising some of my conclusions.
I don't think you in this talk really explained how pandemics relate to your research of sacrifice. Do you want to just get into that a little bit?
Sure. So when backing up to
here and smoke my hookah.
Yeah, smoke your hookah. Look like a wise caterpillar. When we started this whole conversation, I said, this idea struck me as, why would anyone do, self-offering? Why would you self-sacrifice? What are the circumstances that would lead to this kind of extremist behavior? And so I thought, it had to have been, war, famine, persecution, or pandemic or epidemics. And so I started looking at the medical history of where these, there was the plague of Justinian that was probably the first outbreak of the bubonic plague, and that was horrendous. And we have these references from Constantinople of the devastation of that. And then of course we're all familiar with the Black Death in the 1340s. And a lot of people, because they're not very familiar with Indian history, a lot of medical historians have said, well, we heard vague reports coming in from China and India that there was a plague, but we don't really know. Well, that's not true. For example, Ibn Battuta was in Madurai as it was in, but he visited Madurai and he reported in 1345, which was a year before the Black Death hit Europe. He reported about the devastation of this pandemic, this epidemic, that one day someone would be healthy, the next day they'd be dead, or they'd be healthy in the morning and dead by night, and so he gave a very vivid description of what must have been the plague, that came through trade route. Madurai was on the trade routes, and it must have gone through there as it went through all seaports and major trading cities along the way from one side of the world to the other. Yeah, and so what do you do when you don't understand contagion and you don't understand why, why people are dying all around you? What's your inclination to bargain with the gods? And this idea that, keep my king safe, keep the stability of society safe. I'll make this offering to the god or the goddess in the hopes that my family will be saved or my society will be saved. Save the world, and I will offer myself in a couple of years. Because within Bhakti and within Tantra, which became very powerful movements in these times in medieval India, there's this idea of taking a vow of vrat, that you will make a pilgrimage, or you will make these fasts, or you will do some kind of offering. And there were temples like Sri Sailam, for example, which is now in Andhra Pradesh, or Telangana.
Tirupati is famous
Yeah,
for making vows and going to, I mean, I did that.
yeah, right, right. That's, you know, sort of the lesser of the, but people are still shaving their heads and so on. So, you know, I will go and I will fulfill my vow by having my hands cut off, or, you know, other more gruesome things. And I think it was, you know, society, the 14th century was absolutely horrendous everywhere. But it resulted in profound social change. You know, we know that it was the end of feudalism in Europe, you know.
Right.
And whether or not things are still susceptible to those kinds of changes, we don't know now in this day and age. You know, will we have profound change when we come out the other side of this? But what's fascinating to me are all the crazy conspiracy theories that have turned up.
Oh, it's horrible.
It's horrible, but you can see, it's like you open up this little doorway into,
like that pandemic video that's been running around.
Oh my God.
Where did that come from?
But it's, you know, it's like people who want to see that they are out to get us.
Right.
You know, and so how do we respond? Do we respond, you know, with altruistic impulse to help society, to work on the front lines and or do something, you know, help those around us who are suffering, or do we act, you know, with selfish?
I would hope, if nothing else comes out of this pandemic, the idea that we need to sink more money into our medical systems comes out of it.
A bare minimum, yeah.
Yeah, that's the bare minimum that has to happen. You know?
It's shocking, isn't it?
And our educational systems, because that's one thing I really notice now in Udaipur, and I shouldn't pick on Udaipur because it's just as bad in the US, but it's like people just don't really understand how the virus is spread. You know, I mean, not that all scientists even understand it in its particulars yet, but I mean, like, no concept of it whatsoever. You know, people saying, well, it's going to rain now. When the rain comes, the virus will go away. It's like, no, it won't.
Yeah. Yeah, you see some really good, well, look at Trump talking about ultraviolet light and you know, disinfectant and stuff. And people want to feel that there has to be an answer. It's got to be a simple answer, something we've overlooked. You know, if only we could all just go out and sit in the sun for 20 minutes a day, you know, or the rains would come. Or...
Well, we all want the magic potion, don't we?
Yeah.
It's part of the archetypal experience of mankind.
Yeah. We want an easy answer.
Magic potion, yes.
But it's really, if you spend time on social media, which of course everyone does these days obsessively, all of a sudden it seems like in the last week, the conspiracy theory level has it's ignited, hasn't it?
I think because people are so spoiled, and you know, that the first month or something, everybody was willing to lock down for the good of society. It's an element of sacrifice again. Sacrifice for the good of society, stay in your home. And now our societies are so spoiled, so hedonistic, that we can't bear it anymore. You know, we can't bear this sacrifice. We need to find a solution. There has to be a magic solution or a quick solution to it.
I don't know if in India it's as bad here, but they lifted the ban on alcohol sales here for one day.
Right.
Oh my God. Because the government, of course, needs the tax revenue.
Right.
The people went crazy buying booze. I mean, just completely nuts. And that is somehow we need this barrier between ourselves and reality. And so if you're an alcoholic, you know, it's like, okay, I'm desperate for cheap booze. But if you're slightly, you know, conspiracy theories are another way of numbing yourself and you know, deflecting reality, you know, blaming it on somebody else. And
yeah, but conspiracy theories can be entertaining sometimes.
Yeah.
I know we
Right.
differ on that. My blood pressure doesn't go up real high on conspiracy theories until people start honestly taking them seriously. You know,
Right.
to me, they're like fairy tales. And it's like, well, this is kind of interesting. Maybe there's a nugget of truth in it somewhere. But when people just buy into them, hook, line, and sinker, you know, and say, well, this is what's happening. And it's like, oh, God, don't you think? Don't you analyze anything?
Well, unless you have a PhD in cellular biology or epidemiology, just sit down, you know?
Exactly. Exactly. Which we wish Trump would do. He is his own worst enemy right now.
Yeah, he is. He's
And
so,
you know, I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I don't pick on him all the time. I think he gets treated too harshly by the media many times. But like ever since this pandemic has started, he's just been a nightmare. They should just lock him up.
well,
Lock
you know,
him up and
also,
let other people do the talking. You
but
know.
he so craves attention that
Right.
if he could just stand in the background and let Dr. Fauci and these other authorities
Right.
speak about this, and he just stood there looking presidential in the background, he would get lots of points for sort of having dealt with this,
Right.
but he
Right.
just can't help himself.
Right. Right.
He has to get in there and say crazy crap, you know?
My cousins in Chicago keep referring to acting President Como. Acting President Como, because he certainly comes off as more presidential now than Trump does. And I still think, this is my guess, we're getting way off the subject. My guess is Joe Biden's going to get totally Me Too'd and out of the race, and they're going to draft Como. That's my
Oh, really? Oh, that's an interesting
who knows,
idea.
but
You know, poor old Biden.
yeah.
Um, I mean, who would want the job right now? It's not going to be easy. Whoever gets it, it's not going. But let's just hope it's somebody other than Trump. You know? Just about anyone would be better.
So anyway, I think we've spoken for about an hour.
Okay.
You want to hawk your book a little more?
No, it's
I
okay.
was actually going to order your book because I don't have a copy and they're not shipping to Udaipur now. There's no couriers coming here on
Oh,
Amazon. But I'm wondering, does it have illustrations in it? Are there
yes, it does.
miniatures in it? It does.
Yeah, yeah, it does.
Why
Do you want
don't
me to go
you?
get a copy of my book?
Can
Can
you
I
do
get?
this? You
Yeah.
can show a copy. I'll
Okay.
insert one in the video anyway, so you don't
Okay.
have to run and get it. But
Oh, okay.
send me a couple images from your book
Okay.
and the
Yeah.
book cover, and I will insert them into this talk in, specific places where they seem like they might seem appropriate.
Okay. Will do.
Where I don't
Do
like
it.
what you're saying, I'll just like put an image of somebody's head coming off.
Right.
So
There's some really grisly ones.
I know, I love them. I love dark art. I would put more darkness into the miniatures that I make with Rakesh, but my gallerist hates them. She says, Oswald, they're so hard to sell. Don't put this stuff in the picture.
Really?
Yes,
That's
yes.
interesting.
I you all the
I
time.
wonder after all this if there won't be more appetite for darkness,
There might be.
you know? Because I've always enjoyed dystopian fiction and, sort of dark stories of vampires and all this kind of stuff because and I've always been, I wouldn't say I'm a prepper by any means. But I like the idea of sort of having it together if there's a crisis, because I've spent a lot of my life thinking about this, how do people respond? So, I like the fact that I've got cows and chickens and I can take care of our food and, I'm growing the vegetables and all that,
And you know the
And I
name of
think,
your cows. I heard somebody say somewhere that, you're not living a good life if you don't know the name of the cow your milk came from.
Pansy.
Pansy is your cow?
Pansy. Pansy is the one who's really, and
Pansy?
Galma, Pansy, Pansy, it's like a
That's
flower.
homophobic. Pansy? Is that homophobic? You really are a bad person. And
Why is it always phobic? They have I mean, it's like Daisy or Rosie or something.
what's the other cow's name?
Galmarie.
Galmarie. Okay, well, I know
Mhm.
Gal. What's the Marie? Oh, Gal Marie.
Galmarie, yeah, it's Sinhala. And then the other one is
Annalise?
Daisy.
Okay.
So Pansy and Daisy, but Pansy's the one who's actually giving milk right now. Daisy will be bred in about 6 months. And Galmarie is basically just a lawnmower. She clears out the undergrowth down in the rubber plantation.
Well, I think this was a wonderful conversation. We didn't stick on topic very well, but I think people will enjoy it.
It was fun. It was really fun. Love doing
Thank you
it.
for talking to me. Mary Storm, goodbye from Udaipur. Bye. Take care.
Bye.
This is
Yeah.
Evil O signing out. Bye.
Bye.